Hey everyone, it's Wednesday, favorite day of the week, because Wednesdays are for conversations with Waldemar about the book of Acts. And so we get to jump in to read more about how Jesus is at work and discuss that together right now.
Okay, so the story starts to shift. Now we have Peter and John going to the temple to pray, 3 o'clock prayer. So this would be like a normal thing, rhythm of their life. They're going to go to prayer and they encounter this guy he was lame from birth, and he's at the temple gate, the one called Beautiful, and there's this exchange that they have. Um, in this section, I find it really interesting that there's two things that are mentioned, and just because I'm trying to get a lay of the land. So it talks about the Beautiful Gate. It also talks about Solomon's colonnade. So I was just wondering, like, what picture do we have? Where are they? Is this a normal thing? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, they've got it's been identified in archaeology and stuff like that, or at least there's a pretty good idea on where this was, because all of that was torn down. Remember,
Right,
Jesus had said not one stone will be left on the other, and that isn't too exaggerated. It's pretty much, it was
right.
torn down.
Gone.
But the archaeologists and so on have studied it, and they've kind of figured out where this could have been. And so you had all these different entries into the area around the temple, and each of them had a different name assigned to it. And same with the colonnade. It's all part of that structure and so on. And so, yeah, they're going there. This was a usual thing. Um, I think it was the Sutton brothers who were once asked why they rob banks. And they said, well, that's because that's where the money is. And so, duh. Why are these guys going to the temple? Well, that's where the people are.
Mm.
And so that's where they go. That's also part of later on Paul's missionary strategy. He goes to the synagogue. That's where people gather, and he starts talking about God, and then things expand from there. And so that's
Yeah.
where they're going.
Yeah.
And do we know exactly? I mean, if you go to visit Israel, you may get a tour guide who says, oh yeah, definitely, this is where Jesus stood and stuff like that. That guy is selling you something. It's likely that Jesus was there, but it's not, we don't
Yeah.
have like those footprints in the concrete.
Well, in the Solomon's colonnade or column, that's an interesting idea because Solomon built the first temple, which was then the temple that we're at now in this story is Herod's temple, right? So it's the
Right.
second temple that was built. And so that just was interesting to me that it's like this is like almost a leftover idea of this. It's still that thing. It's still that thing of looking back, right? That they're looking back, and Jesus is saying forward. They're like, but Solomon's temple was so great. So we're going to
Well,
name this after him.
well, they have the temple was rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah.
Mhm.
And then later on, you've got stuff. Herod was really into architecture and building, and so he added on.
There you go.
And so it's the structure is expanded. Probably the area around it owes a lot to Solomon's work and stuff like that. But you've got the story for the when the temple is dedicated with Ezra and Nehemiah. Some of the people are weeping because they remember the former one, and other people
Yeah.
are rejoicing because we have a temple again. And so it's a shifting thing. It's not like
Yeah.
this is the second temple. It is, but it's, yeah,
The expanded version of that.
yeah.
Okay, so then I love this. So there's this healing, and we talked about that on the weekend, and that's great. There's this incredible experience. And then what we have is Peter gives another sermon. I love that it says Peter saw his opportunity and addressed the crowd. So then he starts talking to people of Israel. So I guess this is the thing. So is he still talking? Is in Peter's mind, he's still only trying to help Jews realize that Jesus was the Messiah? Is that still like in his mind the mission?
Pretty much. We're going to get an event later on where the Holy Spirit shifts Peter's thinking. But right now, that's still the focus. If I can just retreat a little bit to the guy who is healed.
Do it.
One of the things I find, and I hadn't noticed this before, but one of the things I find delightful about Jesus is how often he asks somebody, what would you like me to do for you?
Yeah.
And this is somebody who's paralyzed, somebody who's blind, who's somebody who You and I would say, well, yeah, we know what that person needs.
Obviously, it's pretty obvious, it seems like.
He doesn't assume. He says, what would you like me to do for you?
Hmm.
And I love that. It's something that I incorporate now into interaction with people. I will say, what would you like me to pray for? I'm not going to assume that I know what you need, because you are you. You know best what you need.
Yeah.
Peter doesn't do that at this moment, but he does something different. The guy's asking for money. And if Peter had just given him money, the guy would have stayed in his former life.
Mm.
What he needed was something that changed his life, and that's what he got. It's a good book called When Helping Hurts. Because
Yeah,
sometimes
that's a good one.
we assume we know what the other person needs. We had this situation here in Jakarta where somebody's working with basically street kids. Actually, if you want to be more graphic, they're the kids who grew up in the trash dump. Their
Wow.
families take care of the dump and take the stuff that can be recycled and sell it, make a living out of that. And there were assumptions made about what the best thing to do would be for these kids. But when the person who was kind of the lead on it and was listening to the Holy Spirit, I believe, asked the families, what do you need? They said, oh, we would just love to have a playground for our kids. And so that's what the Holy Spirit guided the group to prepare for
Wow.
them. And it shows care and concern for the other when you say, what is it that you need? What is it that you are looking
So
for?
that's so important. In our Jesus XP groups, one of our practices, and we're trying experiencing Jesus practices, one of them is give good away. And an idea is to do a project or something in the area. And I think it's so important that what you do is you don't just show up. There was a bad story one time of somebody who just showed up and laid bark at an organization, and they were like, thank you, except for we were going to be changing that out to something else and we had money set aside for it. And like you can do things that's on a smaller scale. But I do think asking that question, that humility, is something that I think the Spirit will lead us to. There's
Yeah.
have you heard the story about Thomas Aquinas had a conversation with the Pope? And the Pope said, in looking at a bunch of wealth, looks at Thomas and says, Thomas, isn't it great that no longer does the church have to say, silver and gold have I none? And Thomas Aquinas said, and isn't it sad that we no longer can say, get up and walk? That there's this tension of like, we look at it and say what we need is more money. And I think what we actually need is more listening to the Spirit to step into the opportunities that God puts in front of
Absolutely.
us.